I've been anticipating this next Idea Fest session since May, when David Marinus told me he would invite fellow author Jonathan Eig to Madison, and Jonathan agreed. Jonathan's new biography of Martin Luther King is simply titled King, a Life, and is both a New York Times bestseller and appeared on Barack Obama's recommended reading list this summer. Jonathan spoke yesterday at the Texas Tribune Festival. We were talking backstage in Austin. He is in Austin, and made it all the way here today. So we very much appreciate him travel through airports to be at Idea Fest. The New York Times called Jonathan's book on King the first comprehensive account of the civil rights icon in decades. A Times reviewer called it supple, penetrating, heartstring-pulling, and compulsively readable. A Washington Post reporter says it is infused with the narrative energy of a thriller, the most compelling account of King's life in a generation. In this book, Jonathan describes King's formative years and how he built his astounding oratorical skills, and this particular passage from Jonathan's book capsulized it for me. King's genius would be his ability to deliver messages that inspired black and white listeners alike, messages that made racial justice sound like an imperative for all, messages that crossed lines of theology and geography that suggest that both sides needed to act if the racial divide were ever to be erased without violence. So we not only have the treat of hearing from Jonathan, but having David as moderator. When I interviewed Jonathan for a column advancing this session, he talked about how he and David are cut from the same cloth, two newspaper guys who adapted their skills to learn to write biographies. He described David as, in a sense, a role model. Jonathan's book is for sale in the lobby, and he's going to hang around afterwards and autograph copies, and I have read it and couldn't recommend it more enthusiastically. David, as you know, published a book last year about the life and struggles of the great Native American athlete Jim Thorpe. Their books on King and Thorpe are similar in being meticulously researched, beautifully written, and each captures the entrenched racism that tortured both men. So with that, please give a warm welcome to Jonathan Eig and David Marinus.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome to Madison, John. He's a Chicago guy, so it's not too far away.
Thank you.
As Paul said, I've long admired all of your works, and it seems to me that in some sense they've become exponentially more important, each one as they go along. None more so than this last one. I can't think of a more important figure or more imposing figure to try to tackle than Martin Luther King Jr. And you've done it marvelously, even knowing that two previous biographers of sorts have won Pulitzer Prizes writing about him, which is another amazing, it seemed to me it took so much guts for you to try to do this.
Stupidity, guts, that's a fine line.
Exactly, I know that. But how and when did the light go on that this was your next book?
Well, let me say, first of all, that the Garrow book and the Taylor Branch book, which both won Pulitzers, were marvelous, huge achievements, incredible scholarship, but they're not biographies. And Garrow and Taylor Branch don't call them biographies either, and they're books that are civil rights books with a lot of King in them. And I wanted to write a King book with a lot of civil rights in it.
Yeah.
And I wanted to write a more intimate book. Those books don't make you cry at the end. They're beautifully written, they don't make you cry. And I recognized that it had been 40 years since the last true biography of King. And that shouldn't happen. We need a new biography of someone like King every generation, at least, because the world changes and his meaning changes. And at the same time, I had this epiphany, really, because I was interviewing people for my Muhammad Ali book who knew King. And every time they started talking about King, I lit up. I found myself going off the tracks. I wasn't talking about Ali, and I was there to talk about Ali, and suddenly we just spent an hour talking about King. And, I'll never forget, it was Dick Gregory who really, I think, probably gave me the idea more than anyone else, because Dick Gregory said to me, and for those of you who don't know Dick Gregory, legendary comedian and activist, and he said to me, do you know the difference between Martin Luther King and Jesus? And I thought it might be a joke, so I kept my mouth shut. And he said, no, the difference is that we have video. And that's when it occurred to me, not only do we have video, we have people who knew King, including this guy I'm sitting across the table from. And I would be a fool not to take advantage of that. So I just made up my mind that I was going to spend the next few years, as long as it took really, interviewing everybody I could find who knew Martin Luther King, and that's really how it started.
This did come with several advantages. One is that there were so many people still alive who knew him. Another is there was another whole sheaf of new documents that would become available. And I would say the third advantage might be that he was gone.
Yeah.
We've both written books about people who were alive and who were dead. Lou Gehrig and Clementi for me, and Ali and Thorpe, who died young and didn't have an afterlife, whereas Ali and Jim Thorpe both had this long afterlife. I can't think of any life that was more compressed than this one. 38 years.
Yeah, it's worth reminding folks that he was 39 when he died, and 26 when he became the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott. So we're talking about really a 13-year career as an activist, and an extraordinary 13 years. But still, to think about what a young man he was, that's part of what I'm trying to do, is to remind you of his humanity. And you mentioned the fact that it's, in some ways it's easier to write about people when they're gone. One of my old college professors used to say biography subjects are like snakes, they're best handled dead. And in the case of King, it was not only helpful that, well, I don't want to sound crass about it, but it was helpful also that Coretta had passed away, because a lot of people were more open to being honest, knowing that they didn't have to worry about what Coretta was going to say. And at the same time, I had access to things, to archival materials that Garrow and Taylor Branch didn't know about, weren't available at that time. And Garrow and Taylor Branch generously shared their research materials with me. But, I found tapes that Coretta began recording right after Martin Luther King's assassination. And nobody...
Where did you find those, and what were they like?
So you know how sometimes we can spend a year or two looking for one little document. It took me 2 years to find Martin Luther King Sr.'s autobiography. But he had an unpublished autobiography. That's another story. It took me 2 years to find that. The King family didn't know it existed. But with the Coretta tapes, this was so easy that I almost can't believe it. I found a note in Garrow's book saying that Coretta had done an interview with Harriet Meyerson, who was her ghostwriter and editor for her memoir. So I Googled Meyerson. Her papers were at University of Florida, and I said, I see that Meyerson did some interviews with Coretta Scott King for this book. Do you have the files there? They said yes. I said, I'm just wondering, because Garrow is quoting from transcripts of those interviews. Are there tapes? And he says yes. And I said, well, they're not on the finding aid. They're not listed in the on your website. He said, that's because the King family doesn't want us to have them, and they claim that they were their possession, but that was 20 years ago, and they haven't come asking for the tapes. And I said, well, can I come to Florida and listen to those tapes? And he said, no, you don't have to. I just emailed them all to you.
Oh, the advantages of the modern world. Yes. Well, I don't know if the audience cares, but I love this sort of story. So tell me how there was an autobiography of the old man that was hard to find?
Yeah, so Daddy King, as everybody called him, published an autobiography. But I was working with a genealogist. We were trying to track down the King's ancestry, trying to figure out where their family might have been enslaved.
Yeah.
And this genealogist says to me, are you aware of this Daddy King biography? And I said, oh yeah, that's the one from 1982. And she says, no, this one's from 1973. And I said, I don't think so. And she said, well, I found a note mentioning it in a family tree. And then I found out that the King Center in Atlanta had it, but didn't know they had it. And it took a lot of finagling for me to find somebody who would go in there and copy it for me. But there were only 2 copies of this, as far as I know, in the world, and the King children didn't know it existed.
Now, one of the things, even if the subject is dead, one of the often headaches that as biographers we deal with are the family that's left behind.
Yeah.
And the King family was sort of noted for being somewhat guarded and difficult to deal with. Did you suffer from that, and how did you get around it?
I didn't get around it. I suffered from it. I should say that a lot of King's nieces and nephews, cousins were very friendly
Yes.
and very helpful and
Right.
and offered great insights about the family's history. But the three surviving King children did not want to cooperate with me for the book, and I kept asking, and I kept, reminding them that I was making friends, and I was asking friends of theirs to intervene, and they just declined. And I sent them a lot of my discoveries, just thought you should have this, and whether they never responded to me, but I sent them copies of the Daddy King autobiography, just stuck it in an envelope, sent it to their homes, and that's okay. I don't really know why they didn't want to participate. I have my hunches. I think it's because they didn't want to be involved with a book that talked about the adultery of their father. I think that's still hard for them.
There are so many, I'd read both of those other books, but yet there were so many things in this book that sort of hit me in a different way. And one of them was, I knew, we all know about the mountaintop speech, and sort of the premonitions of his death. But I didn't know that it had been going on for many, many years before that he had this feeling that he wasn't going to live.
Well, remember that he'd been stabbed in the chest, his home had been bombed, his house had been shot at, he was getting death threats at least weekly, if not daily sometimes, and the federal government had declared that he was public enemy number one when it came to race. So it was not irrational for him to think that he might not live a long life. And at the same time, and I don't mean to make light of it, that's just the kind of pressure he lived with every day, but at the same time, he suffered from anxiety, from what some of his friends called depression, what Coretta often described as depression. And it's no wonder that he would give several speeches, several sermons over the years, talking about the fact that he might not live a long life and how he wanted to be remembered and how he wanted to spend his time. And, I would also point out that he was hospitalized numerous times for what he called exhaustion, but others, and clearly today we would call depression or severe anxiety. When he got the news of the Nobel Peace Prize, he was in the hospital. He received that news in the hospital, and he had been unable to sleep and had taken sleeping pills the night before. And when the phone rang, and it was Coretta saying, "You're not going to believe this. You've won the Nobel Peace Prize." He had no idea if he was dreaming it or not. And then another just great example of his courage, one of many. He just invited the reporters to come and interview him in his hospital bed. And if you look at the New York Times, the picture of King after he won the Nobel Peace Prize is a picture of him with the sheets over his chest. It's extraordinary.
I'm always obsessed myself, and I know you are too, with sort of the forces that shape the individuals we're writing about. And in this case, you've got the church, the family, and the Jim Crow South. The church, I love that scene where his babysitter would sort of have them practice preaching, right? And so it started when he was how old?
Before he could read, he was reciting Bible verses and pretending, the way we used to play cops and robbers, or the way we used to imitate the batting stances of our favorite baseball teams. King would imitate the preachers that he heard growing up. And in particular, the preachers who he thought were a little more polished than his father, because one thing he discovered early, like a lot of us, is that he wanted to be cooler and hipper and smarter than his dad. And King's father was a country preacher. He was born into sharecropping and worked on the farm until he was 12 years old as sharecropping on land that was owned by a white owner, and no chance of advancement, no chance of owning that land for his family. So Daddy King, at the age of 13, leaves Stockbridge, walks, ties his only pair of shoes over his shoulders, walks barefoot because he doesn't want to wear out his shoes, walks barefoot toward Atlanta and takes a job on the railroad, starts to get educated, teaches himself to preach, and becomes a traveling preacher. And by the time he becomes a big success, the head of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, he's still a country preacher. And he's very emotional, he stomps and he shouts, and it embarrasses his kid. Young little Mike, as they called him, because he was born Mike King. Martin Luther King Sr. changed his name as he became more advanced in his career and wanted to sound more respectable, and told his son, guess what, you've got a new name too now. So Little Mike King, or ML as his childhood friends call him, became Martin Luther King Jr. But very early on, he would travel all through the neighborhood, checking out different preachers and learning to imitate them, and then practicing on pets, baptisms on pets and funerals for dead birds. And that was their idea of fun. So it's no wonder that he resisted it for a while, again, trying to be different from his dad, saying, I'm going to be a doctor or I'm going to be a lawyer. But the gravitational forces were too great.
Right. But you're shaped not only by someone, but in reaction to them. And he
Yes.
was very much shaped in reaction to his father, not just in that way, but other ways as well.
Yeah, one of the big ways that really fascinates me is, his father was very domineering, could be physically, could be violent at times, spanked the children, sometimes did it on the front yard so the neighbors would see. And King, young King, really had a very hard time confronting his father, and all his life really had a hard time confronting not just his father, but other figures of
Which is amazing
power.
to think about, isn't it? The most strongest civil rights activist and confrontational, in a sense.
Yeah, the
was
greatest
afraid-
protest leader
Yeah.
maybe in our
Yeah.
country's history, doesn't like conflict.
Yes.
But that, again, makes me love him even more because
Yeah.
he's fighting his natural instincts to do what he feels like he needs to do. So when you see him in conflict with Roy Wilkins of the NAACP or even with the president, his instinct is always to be silent, to let them have their say, to avoid disagreement, and it hurts him sometimes because he tends not to speak up in those settings. And then he walks away later and feels bad that he didn't get what he wanted or didn't express himself. But it's the same thing with his father. When his father says, you're not going to seminary, you don't need to go to seminary, you certainly don't need a doctorate, King just says, okay, Dad, and then he goes and does what he wants to do. And when his house gets dynamited in Montgomery as the bus boycott begins, both Daddy King and Coretta's father drive immediately to Montgomery and say, we're taking you with us. They've got a new baby in the home. You can't stay here. And both King and Coretta say, okay, fine, we'll talk about it later. And of course they stay. So this conflict avoidance is a constant theme throughout his life.
And is that conflict avoidance a reflection of his depression or one of the causes of it, in a sense?
I don't think we can know that, but it certainly could be adding to the anxiety that he feels and the depression he feels, feeling like, it is so crazy because here's a guy who can speak to the nation.
Yeah.
He can call out what other people can't call out, and he can be heard by audiences. He's got the power like no one else has to transcend audiences, to speak to black and white audiences, to speak to across religions, and yet he's afraid to argue with his dad, right? Or afraid to tell LBJ how he really feels.
You also write about, at an early age, his love of big words. That has a special sort of essence to him.
Yeah, he said big words were like his grandma's biscuits. He just wanted to share them. They were so good. He had this burning ambition from a very early age. And whether it comes from being the first son of a very domineering father, or whether it comes from, given that King and I are the same height, I think some of it comes from being a short kid. But he's always pushing. He sneaks into kindergarten a year early.
Yes.
With his sister and says that they're twins, and until the teacher hears him talking about plans for his 5th birthday party, and says, "Get out of here, kid!" And he comes back the next year and he skips a grade, and then he skips another grade. So the ambition is there very early on.
So you see the ambition and you see the history of the church and preaching. Where do you first see the first stirrings of activism?
Oh, I think that's baked in even as much as the religion is, because not only to be black in the South, now his friends used to say that he wasn't bruised by racism the way most of them were, because he grew up in this fairly privileged community. His father's got a job he can't be fired from. He's a preacher, which is why so many preachers become are leading activists, because they can't be fired. And he's in this community where everybody knows him. He's kind of like a prince. So he's not as bruised by Jim Crow South as some others, but nevertheless, he's in the Jim Crow South, and one of the real functions of the black church in the Jim Crow South is to rebel, to try. It's the black social gospel is different from the white social gospel. It's not just about saving your own soul; it's about saving the nation's soul. And that's the way he's raised. So if you believe in the Bible, and he clearly does, then you've got to believe that part of your worship is about changing the community, trying to get the Bible and the Constitution and the society we're living in to all square. And they're clearly not squared. So it's all baked in, I think, to who he is.
But you know, there are a lot of heroic figures in the civil rights movement. Many incredibly powerful preachers in the black church, including one I wrote about, Aretha Franklin's father, who maybe could out-preach Martin Luther King, perhaps, right? And there were other people who could have taken the lead at the Montgomery bus boycott. What was it about King that set him apart from everybody else and put him in that place?
That's a big question,
yeah.
but I'll do my best to get at it. If you just look at what happens in Montgomery, for example, let's just start right there. And we can let's try to limit it to one day. December 5th, 1955. 2 days earlier, Rosa Parks has refused to get off the bus, and the people of Montgomery are deciding what to do about it. And they've been talking for years about boycotting, about standing up for their rights, because as much as they face indignities, as much as they face degradation, there's nothing quite like riding the buses of a southern city for a black person, because it's like a mobile shop of horrors. Every time you get on the bus, you think there's a pretty good chance you are going to be humiliated, abused, possibly even hurt. And maybe this is the moment that they're going to stand up and do something about it. They've tried before, they've talked about it before, maybe this is the moment. And they're looking for somebody to address the crowd. So thousands of people are gathered at Holt Street Baptist Church on December 5th, and they're waiting for instructions. Are we going to stay off the buses Monday? Can we really unite and get this done? Because if 75% of the people stay off the buses, that's not going to do it. So who is going to speak to the crowd that day? It could be E.D. Nixon, the city's most prominent black leader. It could be Rosa Parks. It could be Joanne Robinson, the woman who's been really plotting this boycott for years, the woman who's been petitioning the city to desegregate the buses but getting nowhere with it. It could be another young preacher named Ralph Abernathy, King's best friend. Why do they pick King? It's really because he's new in town and he hasn't made too many enemies yet. And he has a reputation for being an okay speaker. So King does not want this job. Just a couple weeks earlier, maybe a couple months earlier, he'd been asked if he would sit on the board of the NAACP in Alabama, and he said no, he's too busy. He's got a new church, he's got a new baby, not looking for anything else. They asked him to lead this just to be the spokesman for the night. They're not saying lead anything. They're not saying become the nation's leading civil rights activist. They're not saying, just would you speak to the crowd? And he's got 20 minutes to prepare. He rushes home and tells Coretta, I don't know what I just agreed to, but I guess I'm giving a speech, and I think it's the biggest speech I've ever had to give. And he goes back to his study, and he has a panic attack. Can't breathe, can't think. 10 minutes out of the 20 are wasted. He finally catches his breath, jots a few notes. Ralph Abernathy's honking the horn outside, we gotta go. And they hop in the car, and they drive to the church. And that's when Montgomery and the world discovers King that night. And that's when King really discovers his voice, how he didn't know all these pieces were coming together. But he gets up there with no notes and says, it just may be that the black people of America are the ones who are going to teach America how to be America. We know that we are right in trying to square the Constitution, the Bible, and the way we are treated, and American society. If we are wrong, then the Constitution is wrong. If we are wrong, the Holy Bible is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. And Coretta sent him with a tape recorder. Go home and listen to this on YouTube. The crowd goes wild. And from that moment on, they feel like God has sent them this young man. And what's so powerful about it is that, and I say this in the passage that you heard in the introduction, he found a voice that resonated not just with that black audience of churchgoers, but that spoke to so much of America. If you believed in the Bible, if you believed in the Constitution, you had to at least pause. No matter how racist your instincts, you had to at least pause and say, well, that is true, I guess. And certainly the white media in the North, this really resonated. And they began to see a great story here. So the Northern media comes down in large part because of King's vision and because of this message. And that becomes this huge national story, and King is off and can never return to his quiet life again.
I love that scene in the book, and I can only imagine as you were reporting and writing it, you just saw that something clicked, that this sort of set up so much that would come after. If you don't mind, could you deconstruct for us how you reported that part of the story, how you found out about the panic attack and took it from, all the way through to the speech?
Well, that one was not one of the harder tasks when it came to research, because we have the tape, we have lots of accounts of this from King's own words. He wrote a book shortly after the end of the Montgomery bus boycott, and there's this guy named Lawrence Dunbar Reddick,
Right.
who happened to be on the scene. And there was a white newspaper reporter there at the church, Joe Asbell from the Montgomery Advertiser. But I want to talk about Lawrence Reddick for a second, because Reddick was working as a college professor at Alabama State, and he had formerly been an archivist and a librarian at the Schomburg Library in Harlem.
Yeah.
And now he's in Montgomery, and he sees this young preacher. He starts showing up at the meetings and taking notes, because that's just his instinct as an archivist.
Amazing. Yeah.
And he writes a biography of King just at the end of the Montgomery bus boycotts, the first biography of King. So I know you and I love this, because the first thing you do is you say, what happened to L.D. Reddick's notes? Where are they? Where are those papers? I know that, you and I would have been fighting to get to them first if you'd been working on the same subject. So I just Google Lawrence Dunbar Reddick archives, and it turns out that he had just recently donated. He had passed away, and all of his papers had gone to the Schomburg Library in Harlem.
Right.
And the boxes had not been opened yet. Thousands of pages.
Wow.
And he stayed with King throughout his entire career. When King went to India, it was Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King, and Lawrence Dunbar Reddick, the three of them on the trip. And he writes down what they ate on the plane. He writes down that King took a nap on Coretta's lap on the plane. He talks about, how much all the tourist sites in India that they skipped because they were too tired. He's brilliant. If only he had better handwriting. But that was really helpful to me in researching Montgomery. I'll say one more thing about Montgomery. Another discovery I made is that Fisk University sent a team of sociologists to document the Montgomery bus boycott as it was happening. And these mostly black, some white sociologists interviewed everybody. They interviewed women who were in the carpools. They interviewed white bus drivers. They interviewed the white employees of the women who were walking to work and the men who were walking to work. And if they were sitting in a cafe and they overheard a conversation, they made a note of it. And all of these files are at the Amistad Research Center at Tulane, and just a gold mine. So I at one point I said to my editor, could I just do a whole book on Montgomery? Let's do this in 3 volumes. Didn't go over well. Probably the right decision.
Yeah, I think so in this case. What were the roots of his nonviolent philosophy, and how did he struggle with that over the years?
That's a really interesting question. First of all, he's trying to live in the example of Jesus. So there's obviously nonviolence is baked in early there. And then in college, he does read Gandhi and Thoreau and others, and goes a little deeper. While he's in seminary, he hears a lecture by Mordecai Johnson who'd been to India and talked about his meetings with Gandhi. But I think he's interested in nonviolence, and he's talking about it to some extent when the bus boycotts begin. But one of the things that's interesting is that when the bus boycotts begin and they begin to attract national attention, a lot of more established activists, older activists, see what's happening, and they recognize that this young man has a special gift, and that he's attracting attention, and that they could use that if they could get him to somehow expand this beyond Montgomery. And they flock down there, and they begin to try to talk to him. And one of them is Bayard Rustin, who's a Quaker, and says, let's talk about nonviolence. It seems to be something that's clicking here. The northern media especially likes the fact that you guys are willing to suffer for this. That's part of the story so it's practical, right? Like, the media likes this. We should keep going. But Bayard Rustin says, if you're really going to stick to this nonviolent thing, you, Dr. King, might want to get rid of the gun that you're keeping under the sofa cushion. So I think in the beginning it's pragmatic for King. I think he's not necessarily deeply feeling the philosophy, but he grows into it, and he begins to really appreciate it more over time. And even at the end, some of his friends, some of his colleagues, some of his rivals would say they thought it was really just a strategy, not a deep philosophy. But it's hard to say.
Yeah, but it's interesting that it's growing within him at the same time that it's diminishing within the black movement.
That's right. It's one of the things that really distinguishes him and causes challenges for him, because a lot of the other black activists are saying, oh, hell no, we're not turning the other cheek. You know, you hit me, I'm going to hit you back. And Malcolm X and others use that to try to diminish King and to say that he's weak, to say that pacifism is for suckers. And, you know, King counters that by saying, no, it takes more strength to be a pacifist.
Let's talk about the relationship between King and Malcolm X. I know they met a few times. And
Met only once.
Once.
Yeah.
Is that just the only time?
Yeah.
Yeah. But where was the tension personal as well as political or ideological, or how did King view Malcolm, first of all? It's more clear how Malcolm viewed him.
I think King had a great tolerance for criticism. Maybe again because he didn't like conflict, so he was just going to try to be big about it. But I think he genuinely respected and enjoyed listening to the people who challenged him. Now he recognized that Malcolm X was using him, you know, posturing by casting King as an Uncle Tom, as he called him often. Reverend Dr. Chicken Wings, he called him on one occasion. Accent on the chicken, I think, as in, you know, he's afraid to fight. King recognized that was a way for Malcolm to draw more attention and to draw younger, more radical activists to his side. Same thing with Stokely Carmichael, Black Power. King would never say the words together. He would say black, and he would say power, but he wouldn't put them together. The way Stokely Carmichael was just, you know, begging him, and King would say, "I know what you're trying to do, and I know how that it's helping you by casting me as the conservative one, and that's okay. You do what you got to do." But he listened to them. I think one of my discoveries in my research that probably got the most attention is that I found that the quote that we've been teaching school kids for decades, where King was asked what he thought about Malcolm X, had been entirely fabricated by Alex Haley for Playboy magazine. The quote is that King's demagogic oratory, King says Malcolm's fiery demagogic oratory is bringing nothing but pain for the black community, and that it's irresponsible. And King never said it. I went and got the transcripts of the interviews and found what King actually said was that I don't always agree with Malcolm, but I also don't believe that I'm the only one who has answers. So he was open-minded, and I think they were growing much more closer in their philosophies over time. In fact, Malcolm was speaking in Selma, in Tuskegee, and I think it was early '63, and the student said, you know, Dr. King is in, so Malcolm's in Tuskegee, and the student said, Dr. King is in Selma. We're going to go hear him speak tonight. Do you want to come with us? And Malcolm goes. And when he gets there, finds that King has been jailed that day. But he meets with Coretta, and they sit together in church. And Malcolm tells Coretta, tell Dr. King that I know what I'm doing, and I hope that by presenting a more dangerous alternative that people might be more inclined to listen to Dr. King.
So tell us when the FBI started to really have him on their radar and how that intensified over the decade.
So when King begins raising attention and making news in Montgomery, the FBI doesn't seem to care. It barely registers on their radar. I think the Alabama office of the FBI files one memo, just some news clips they send in. It's really not until King begins to attract more national attention that he gets on the FBI's radar. And at first their concern is that he has some former Communist Party members in his circles. And there's a lot of understandably, a lot of understandable paranoia about communism in America at that point. And it's also a serious political issue for the Kennedy administration if they're going to be aligned with King, if he's somehow connected to communists. So that might have been justified. But J. Edgar Hoover, using the communist reason, asks Robert F. Kennedy to authorize wiretaps on the phones of some of King's associates and then later on King's home and office. And Robert F. Kennedy approves those wiretaps. And it quickly becomes clear that King and Stan Levinson, who was a former Communist Party leader and fundraiser,
Right.
and Bayard Rustin and a couple of others, are not talking about communism. They're only talking about American democracy and how we can make it stronger. And the FBI actually produces memos saying, yeah, they're not talking about communism. They're very clear about that. But at the same time, by then they've heard him on the phone with women who are not Coretta, and he appears to be engaged in relationships with these women, and that becomes of interest to J. Edgar Hoover. And that becomes the justification for an increased scrutiny.
Reminds me of Whitewater transforming into Monica Lewinsky.
Right.
Same thing, yeah.
Yeah,
Less important.
One of the problems with wiretaps, with bugging people, is that you open a floodgate and you don't know what you're going to get, and maybe that's part of why they do it, because we might get something that we weren't looking for, and that's exactly what happens. And you might ask yourself why, you should ask yourself, why was that important enough to continue the wiretaps? Why was it reauthorized? Because I think the law was every 6 months you had to reauthorize those wiretaps. And I think the only answer really is racism, that they viewed King as a threat to the establishment, to the status quo, to the existing white power structure. And this was something they could use to try to topple him or to undermine him. And the more powerful he became, the more of a following he attracted, the more the FBI began to scrutinize his sex life. And in fact, I think the real turning point of the book, for me, the part where I got the most emotionally upset, was after the March on Washington. Because the March on Washington is this unbelievably beautiful moment in American history when we feel like, a lot of people feel like this country might be turning a corner. And we've just seen nationally televised black and white people literally holding hands and singing in harmony. And the next day, the FBI generates a memo for J. Edgar Hoover that says, based on yesterday's events, based on King's demagogic oratory at the March on Washington, we must now view him, where race is concerned, as the most dangerous person in America. So why is that dangerous? Well, it's only dangerous. Well, I guess you could say Hoover was right if you view change as dangerous.
Going back to the first okay of the wiretaps, why did Robert F. Kennedy approve it?
Well, in large part because Hoover had the goods on the Kennedys.
Yes.
They had their own, extramarital affairs, and Hoover had them documented, had records, had tapes, had recordings from one hotel incident in particular. And Bobby Kennedy talked about it in an oral history he gave at the end of the administration, and kind of
Regretting it or not?
I think he was using it to sort of justify what they did to King, in my opinion. I think he was trying to put his spin on the history there and shift the responsibility. That's my read of it.
And of course, you have the famous attempt to persuade King that he has no choice but to kill himself, which is sort of the low point of the book, in my opinion. And
Yeah.
incredible.
Well, so the FBI was leaking this material to the reporters,
Right.
and reporters weren't writing about it. And one of the other discoveries that I made, and I have to give David Garrow credit for this because he is the one who said to me, have you thought about checking Mildred Stiegel's files? And Stiegel was the secretary to LBJ, and she kept his most important papers in a safe, including his financial documents. And it turns out that there were, I think it was 300 cubic feet of papers in the Mildred Stiegel files.
Wow.
And there were something like 250 pages of King files in Stiegel's papers that were not, and even Robert Caro hadn't been through the Stiegel
found those?
papers yet.
Amazing.
I got them
Does he know that you?
I hope so. I don't hate to tell him that he's got more work to do at this point. I was able to get them declassified, and thank goodness during COVID, some of those archivists were still working.
Yeah.
And what these papers show is that LBJ was not only aware, he was encouraging this gossip, and that's all it really was. He seemed to be enjoying the voyeuristic nature of these memos, and he was encouraging the FBI to leak this to reporters. So they're leaking it to reporters. The reporters are not biting on the story. They're also not biting on the story of the FBI surveilling private citizens, but the FBI is so determined to undermine King, to destroy his reputation that, as you said, they made a compilation of the tapes, sort of the greatest hits of King's hotel rooms and telephone calls, and they mailed it to his office. And Coretta opened the box. There was a letter in there saying King. It was written in a way that was made to sound like it was written by a black man.
It was sent to his house?
Sent to his office, and then from the office it was delivered to his home.
Got it.
And then at his home, Coretta opened it, and it contained a letter that purported to have been written by a black man, was really written by a white FBI agent that said, we know what you're doing, we're going to expose you, the only way out for you is suicide, and you've got 40 days to do it. King listened to that tape and shared it with Abernathy and Andy Young and some others, and Coretta listened to that tape, and somehow, they carried on. But talk about the stress he was under, not only dealing with that, but dealing with the fact that any day he could wake up and see that some reporter had decided that it was time to write that story.
Right. And how did Coretta listen to it?
Coretta listened to it.
And how did she respond?
Well, at least publicly, she said that she didn't hear her husband on that tape, and she knows what she said. I think her comment was, "I know what my husband sounds like in the bedroom," and that wasn't him.
And privately?
We don't know.
You don't know. And how did King himself respond?
He was angry, and again, some of his advisors, this gets back to his relationship with his father, some of his advisors were saying, call him out. Bell the cat, they said. Tell the world what Hoover's been doing to you. And King wouldn't do it. He went in and had a private meeting with Hoover and just basically sat there while Hoover talked for an hour.
Amazing.
Oh, and let me add one more thing about that, because I mentioned that the reporters didn't report the story.
But they talked about it.
They talked about it. And you got to think about, we're a couple of journalists, how did that affect coverage of King over the next 5 years of his life? How did it affect editorial writers? So when King starts getting criticized for attacking racism in the North, when he goes to Chicago and they say, you don't know what you're doing here. When he starts speaking out on Vietnam and they say, stay in your lane, even though he's got the Nobel Peace Prize, stay in your lane, you don't know anything about war and peace. How is the fact that the FBI has been dishing dirt and damaging his reputation for all those years, how is it affecting the way he's covered? And then the way Americans are perceiving him, because his popularity starts plummeting from 65 till the end of his life.
So that must have been exciting when you found the LBJ's, the AIDS files. What were the other things that were, other documents that were available to you that weren't available to the previous writers?
Well, I mentioned the L.D. Reddick papers.
Yes.
I mentioned the tapes that Coretta made when she was working on her autobiography. But I think the most important ones actually are those FBI files. And in the last 3 years, more of them have been released. And Donald Trump did at least one good thing. I won't say how many, but he did at least one good thing. And I think he did it accidentally, because he released he wanted the JFK investigation files to be declassified. And in doing so, he unknowingly declassified the King investigation files too. So over the last 3 years, thousands of more pages have been released from the King transcripts. And we can hear more of his phone conversations. Well, we don't hear them, we only have the transcripts. The tapes themselves are scheduled to be released in 2027. But there are a couple things about these transcripts that are important. And first of all, I should mention that we have every reason to believe that they're accurate, because people who are on those transcripts, like Andrew Young, Bayard Rustin, who got his own FBI files released while he was still alive, said the transcripts are accurate. They were on the phone with King, and the FBI agents are accurately recording and transcribing those conversations. But what's important about them isn't the personal life of King. I mean, that's important because the FBI weaponized it against him.
Yes.
But what's, to me, most useful about it is that we see more of King's humanity. You know, we hear his doubts, we hear his concerns, we hear his own aides, his own advisors, his best friends questioning him and saying, you know, maybe it's not a good idea to go to the north and you know, where you don't really have the same network built up, where you don't have the same support from the media. Maybe it's not a good idea to devote so much attention to Vietnam. It's hurting our fundraising efforts. You know, one of the most painful moments for me in these transcripts is, you know, King gives what I consider his greatest speech, the Beyond Vietnam speech at Riverside Church, exactly a year before his assassination. It's the speech that really summarizes his core beliefs and his evolution as a leader, and how he's beginning to feel like he can no longer remain silent on other issues. Civil rights is not enough. He has to speak out on human rights. He has to speak out on poverty. He has to speak out on war. And he gives this gorgeous speech. And Stan Levinson, one of his best friends, calls him the next day, and we have the transcript of this, thanks to the FBI, and Levinson says, I didn't like that speech. It didn't sound like you. Did someone else write that for you? And it's going to really hurt us. And here's King. He's getting beat up by the press for this speech. The Washington Post, the New York Times, all blasted him for it. And one of his closest friends, somebody he has midnight calls with all the time talking philosophy, somebody who early on was more radical than he was, and now here he is saying, I don't think that was a smart speech. And King says to Levinson, it may not have been smart politically, but I don't care about politics. I'm doing what I think is right morally. Don't you know that by now? And it just breaks your heart.
Yeah, I agree that I think that's his best speech. And if I had to rank sort of three seminal moments, it would be that speech, the letter from the Birmingham jail, and then the dream speech. It's
Yeah.
a third of those three, actually.
Yeah.
But I know that in terms of the drama of his life, the March on Washington, that dream speech is sort of at the core. In a very, very lesser way, I thought of it as like the ice bowl of my Lombardi book, you know, that you can't, that's a key moment, and that you can't wait to write it. And I'm curious how you decided to frame it yourself and use it in that way.
I dreaded writing that chapter
Really?
because how are you going to match King at the podium
Right.
with that voice and with that scene and with the, you know, you can't capture that on the page even remotely. And I was terrified. Now, I interviewed probably 20 people who were there that day at the March on Washington, and I was thinking, I'm wasting my time because the chapter has to be focused on King. And somehow I'm going to have to magically create the force of that speech on the printed page, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And I was talking about this with a writer friend, and just expressing this, like maybe there's some better way, you know, maybe there's a more creative way. And I had two.
You found it.
I found a path, and I basically found it by not plagiarizing, but borrowing heavily from one of my favorite writers, Don DeLillo.
Oh, really?
Do you know
Pafko
at the Wall?
Really?
Right.
Yeah.
So Pafko at the Wall is the introduction. It's the opening. First it was just a novella, and then
Right.
he used it as the introduction to Underworld.
Underworld,
And it's a story of
brilliant.
the Bobby Thompson home run, but it's told from different perspectives.
Yes.
So you get the action on the field, but you also get the kid who jumps the turnstiles and sneaks into the ballpark. And you also get J. Edgar Hoover and Ralph and Jackie Gleason sitting
yeah.
in the stands,
Yeah.
and it's this panoramic view. So I basically made a blueprint of Pafko at the Wall and figured out how I could write the story of the March on Washington with a panoramic view. And I had two interviews that I just could not live without including. One of them was a woman named Francine Yeager, who was 18 years old, and at the last minute just decided, black girl from Chicago, decided to get on the train with her best friend and just get there somehow, and they just wanted to hear Martin Luther King. And the other was the white park ranger standing next to King while King's giving the speech, because I watched the YouTube video like 25 times, and he reaches in a couple times and sticks his hand in front of King's face to adjust the microphone. I said, who does that? Like, who has the nerve to stick their hand? So I Googled
You found
white
him?
guy
Yeah.
standing next to King. March on Washington.
Right.
And up comes the guy's name.
Amazing.
He's still alive. I call him up, and I said,
I love
and I
that.
said, his name is Gunny Gundrum. I said, what were you doing putting your hand in front of King's face? He said, no, I wouldn't have done that. I said, I'll call you back in 5 minutes. Go check it out. And I called him back. He says, oh my God. But so what I did was I told the story of why Francine thought it was so important to be there,
Yep.
and how those words resonated with her. And I talked about Gunny, who had never met a black person until he joined the Army, and was very comfortable with the N-word, and then finds himself standing up there and realizing that, like, oh my God, this is an important man. And I'm a little worried that the microphone might not be in the right place, and maybe people can't hear him clearly enough. And then after a while, he adjusts it again because he's worried that the cameras, the microphone might be blocking part of his face. And what I realized is that was an act of love from Gunny. It's exactly the kind of Christian love that King talked about all the time. And it took the pressure off of me having to replicate King's speech, which I couldn't do.
Right.
So I felt like I had found a way into that chapter that really, it's probably, so when I got done, I stuck it in a little envelope and sent it to Don DeLillo.
Did he respond?
He wrote back this beautiful handwritten note saying, great job.
Oh, really well done. That's great. For sort of personal reasons, I was fascinated by King's relationship with Stan Levinson because what my own dad went through and King's loyalty to him, despite all of the pressures coming from the White House, especially on that. What does that say about him, and how has that relationship deepened?
I think it gets back again to King feeling like he's going to do the right thing. This is a man he trusts, who he believes in. And there was evidence, King didn't know it, that Levinson was still funneling money to the Communist Party, even while he was working with King. And somehow the FBI thought it was more useful to talk about King's sex life in trying to undermine, and then leaking to the press that one of King's top advisors was still funneling money to the FBI. They knew it, and they didn't leak that.
Even though that's where it all started.
Yeah. I think it's a huge error, and maybe they were blinded by their obsession with his sex life. But man, they blew it. But King remains loyal. He cuts Jack O'Dell off, another former communist member, because the White House is saying to him, you got to get rid of these guys. So he gets rid of O'Dell, but he never gets rid of Levinson, and he never gets rid of Bayard Rustin either, who, in addition to having communist ties, is openly gay at a time when hardly anybody was. So King was loyal, and I think it really goes back to his ideals again, that he trusts these people, he knows that they're loyal to him, and he's going to be loyal to them too.
So you listened to Coretta Scott King's tapes. How did your perspective on her change over the course of reporting this?
I came away admiring her even more than I had going into it. And, she had a reputation for being difficult. A lot of King's friends really didn't like her, and it wasn't just sexism. They just really didn't like her. Like Harry Belafonte was, especially, like after she was gone, like they talking some trash about her. But I came away loving her more than ever. And it's important to note when it comes to Coretta, and I was also really determined, because she has not had a good biography, I was really determined to spend as much time as I could in these pages giving her due, because King falls in love with Coretta because she's an activist. She's smart and she's beautiful. So are the other 20 women he's dating at the same time. But he falls in love with her and he says, I want to marry you, because she has more experience as an activist than he does. And she is always a guiding force for him. At the same time, she's being humiliated, not just with his sexual affairs, but with his refusal to let her participate in the movement. Over and over again, she says, I want to be doing more. I feel called by God too. And he's saying, your job is to stay home. And he treats that he has the same disdain or same lack of ability to recognize the potential of women when it comes to others in the membership of the SCLC. Ella Baker should have been the executive director, would have saved King so much trouble. He never really found a reliable executive director, but he was blinded by his own prejudices, which again, for one of our great leaders of equality, our great fighters for equality, he still had his own blind spots.
In some ways, at least his attraction to her reminds me of Bill Clinton and Hillary, although Hillary obviously was able, during her own life, to establish a political sensibility of her own. Coretta more, it came after King was gone, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and it was harder, in part just because of the generational issues. and given that King was was raised in the Baptist church, was extra levels of baked-in sexism, I think. But Coretta certainly never gave up, and late in King's career, she did get a little bit more of a foothold in the activism. She was speaking out on Vietnam a little bit even before he was, and there were many times where he couldn't be somewhere and she would go in his stead. So the last couple of years, she did get a little bit more of an opportunity to speak out.
And was she affecting his own thinking on that? I mean, would he listen to her even though he didn't want her to be out there publicly?
I think he clearly did listen to her. And it's interesting when he wins the Nobel Peace Prize, first thing she says is, "We have a greater responsibility now to speak out on international issues." And she's the one, like I said, in college she was doing protests, and she attended the Progressive Party National Convention. King hadn't protested anything at that point in his life. So I think he really respected that, even if he didn't always respect her in every way. I think he really respected her activism, her big thinking when it came to their responsibilities.
In the many decades since his death, he's become a mythological figure, a myth in many ways, that it's your job to try to penetrate and find the real person. What would you say were the most difficult or the biggest misunderstandings that people have about King, or how he's been misportrayed?
One of the problems that we've had in the last couple of decades in celebrating him is that we have simplified him.
Yes.
We've watered down his message. And I've had arguments about this with some of King's closest friends. So there are some of his closest friends who feel like Coretta made a mistake in seeking a national holiday in his honor, because that it did more, obviously it was a matter of huge pride and a great accomplishment, and it's essential that we should have holidays for people other than white men. But there's the unintended consequence of that holiday, as some of them argue, is that King's image has been distorted almost beyond recognition. Yep. That all we talk about is I have a dream and content of our character. And we even see content of our character being weaponized by the opponents of civil rights to say that we don't need affirmative action. We don't need reparations, because didn't Dr. King say we should just be judged by the content of our character? Didn't he say that we should all be treated the same? And that is partly a result of the fact that we have lost touch with what he actually did say, and we've rendered a safer version of King to make all of us feel more comfortable with him. And there are some people who think that was intentional, that's what the government does. They take the radicals and they defang them and make them more accessible so that people are less likely to learn how to be radicals. And maybe that's a cynical view, but part of why I wanted to write this book, and part of why I think we need new King books every generation, is because he can speak to us if we listen to his real words, not just I have a dream and content of our character, just the I have a dream speech itself. It's a two-part speech. There's the part he wrote and he reads from as he's standing there at the podium for the first 8 or 9 minutes. And that speech is a radical speech. That speech calls out police brutality, and it talks about the fact that black Americans were issued a check that came back with insufficient funds, and that we were never going to have justice in this country until that check was redeemed. And then the second half of the speech is when he goes to church and gives us the I have a dream. But we would do well to try to teach students, maybe kindergarten is when you get the I have a dream speech, but by middle school, we should be reading the first half of that speech too.
Except in Florida.
Right, yeah.
But
especially in Florida.
Especially in Florida, yes. Well, Martin Luther King does speak to us today, and your book helps us hear him again. So, John, I can't thank you enough for coming here and for writing this brilliant book, which, as another author, I'm happy to say is on sale outside, and you all should read. It's really a terrific book, and thank you so much.
Thanks, David.
Yes.